Hello! Today I'm going to be reading The Wump World. This is one of my absolute favorite books about taking care of the earth and respecting the creatures that live there and not being wasteful or destructive. The Wump World was a very small world. It was a lot like ours, but much smaller. It did not have great big oceans or lofty mountains or giant rainforests or broad sandy deserts. The Wump World was mostly grassy meadows, little clumps of leafy green trees, and with a few winding rivers and lakes. But it was perfect for the Wumps, and the Wumps were the only creatures living there. The Wumps were a simple, grass-eating animal, and they spent most of their time grazing on the tall, tender grass that grew in the meadows. In the warm weather, they cooled themselves in the crystal-clean rivers and lakes, and at night they slept in the shelter of the bumbershoot trees to keep the dew off their backs. The Wumps had no enemies or predators. They just walked around as they pleased with nothing to worry about. However, the Wumps would have worried if they had known that someone 1,000,000 miles away was watching their little world. One morning, the Wumps were awakened by a far-off sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in the sky, so they looked up, and zooming straight down for their planet came a great big flock of pot-bellied metal monsters, with tails and fins, spitting fire and shooting out streaks of black smoke into the air. Some kind of spaceship. As the monsters swooped down to land, huge legs sprang out from their bulging sides, and like gaping mouths, doors flew open and ramps shot down to the ground, and down the ramps walked a horde of tiny little creatures swarming out onto the meadow. These were the Pollutians, from the planet Pollutus. They had left their worn-out planet to start a new life in a new world. And after such a long journey, the Pollutians were overjoyed to find themselves on solid ground once more. They were all prattling with excitement as they followed their leader, the topmost Pollution and world chief, across the meadow. At the top of a hill, the chief stopped for a long time and looked at the surrounding countryside. Finally, he said, "It looks good. We'll take it. Plant the flag, Sergeant. Let's get things going." So, out of the spaceships came giant machines, thundering out, rolling down runways and out onto the meadows. The timid Wumps had been watching warily from under the trees, but at the sight of these giant machines, all the Wumps went running. "Wump, wump, wump, wump!" they cried, and in a wild-eyed panic, they all went humpity-clumping off through the trees to go diving headlong into the nearest cave. Down, 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 down they fell into the cave, tumbling head over heels through a twisting tunnel to huddle together at the bottom, where they could hear the earth-shaking machines rumbling and roaring overhead. Once they got started, those monstrous machines moved at a furious pace, gobbling up trees and grinding them to bits. More giant machines flattened the ground, followed by great scoopers and scrapers and diggers and giant cranes, and soon the entire Wump World was overrun. The busy little Pollutians kept their mighty machines going full blast, day and night, without a let-up, in a frenzy to improve their wonderful new world. Suddenly, great big cities sprung up, huge factory buildings with towering smokestacks, high-rise apartment buildings, and tall, tall office buildings, and above them all loomed a 100-story skyscraper. And along with the buildings came a tangle of streets and freeways with on-ramps and off-ramps and overpasses and underpasses, jammed with trucks and buses and cars of all sizes, rushing pell-mell all day long in every direction. It was one great big turmoil of noise and smoke, and there was still more to come. Meanwhile, The poor Wumps remained underground, wandering aimlessly through the caverns, feeding on the fuzzy green moss growing on the ledges and the mushrooms clustered in the crannies, and sipping on the sweet water from pools fed by the clean underground springs. But they were not happy. For all they knew, they might have to spend the rest of their lives down here. The Wumps were too afraid to go up to the surface, not even to take a peek. They were too frightened by the endless rumbling, roaring, and screeching up above. And it was getting louder every day. Ugh. There was more and more noise and more of everything. More buildings with more smoke stacks puffing more and more smoke. More freeways with more traffic shooting out more and more clouds of exhaust. And more trash and sludge and piles and slimy streams being poured into the rivers and lakes. Gross. Pretty soon, the cities were so clouded by factory smoke and fumes from the freeways that Pollutians could barely breathe. They went sneezing and wheezing about the streets, grouching and grumbling and blaming each other for the awful mess they were in. Gross. One day, a big, angry crowd gathered outside the World Tower, demanding to see the World Chief. When the chief appeared on his balcony, all the Pollutians began shouting at once, "We can't breathe the air! We can't drink the water! And we can't stand the noise! We've had enough!" "True," sneezed the chief. "I know just how you feel. And something will be done at once, I promise." So with no time to lose, the chief called for a meeting with his 3 top outer spacemen. "Gentlemen," he said, "this world of ours has gone sour. We've got to get out of here quick. But first we must find a new world, a clean one, a better one. So that's your job, men. Get going." "Righto, Chief," barked the 3 astronauts, and within 15 minutes they were off to the spaceport aboard their spaceships. And then, zroosh, 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 off they went in 3 different directions. And in seconds, they were zooming about in outer space at 7,000 miles per hour. Days passed with no word from the outer spacemen. And after waiting a week, the World Chief flew into a rage. "Blast it all!" he shouted. "What's keeping those blithering bubbleheads?" But then one Monday morning, out of the dark, smudgy sky, swooshed back one of the spaceships. And out popped the spacemen, shouting, "I've done it! I've done it! I've found a new world, a bigger and better one!" "Nice going, lad!" cried the World Chief, and the crowd gathered at the spaceport to give their hero one great rousing cheer, which ended in a fit of coughing and sneezing. In no time at all, the great news had sent flashing around the world over radio and TV, warning all Pollutians to be packed up and ready to go within 1 day, 24 hours. At dawn the next day, the entire population swarmed into the Space Center and crowded back aboard their giant spaceships. After double-checking to make sure all Pollutians were accounted for, the World Chief gave his signal for blast-off. And with a thunderous roar, the giant ships all shot off the ground, kazoom, up and away, through the smoke-blackened sky, and they were gone. At long last, peace and quiet settled over the Wump World. The sudden silence came as a shock to the Wumps. They could not believe their ears. They were still afraid, and they didn't want to take any chances, so they remained in their caverns with their ears cocked, listening for the slightest sound. After a long silence, they decided it was time to go, and led by the biggest Wump, they crept up to the tunnel to the cave entrance and found it covered with a crust of cement. With one powerful push of his snoot, the biggest Wump bumped his way through. And then one by one, the Wumps waddled out onto a freeway, and they gaped with wide-eyed amazement. They had feared something awful was happening to their world, but this was much worse than they could have imagined. Everywhere they looked, They were staggered by the size of the huge buildings with walls and walls of windows on every side, and the broad, hard crust covering the earth, which felt cold to their feet. There was no sign of life, or trees, or grass. Even the sky was gone, and the Wumps wondered if there was anything left for them. At least they must look around and find out. So they wandered the freeways for miles, only to find more and more buildings with endless heaps of wreckage and rubble. For all they could see, their world looked completely ruined. Footsore and weary, the Wumps were about to give up and head back to the cave when the biggest Wump let out a joyful Wump! And just ahead of them was a grassy meadow with a clump of bumbershoot trees. It was a park. It was all that was left of their lovely world. Wump, wump, wump! The Wumps went wump-wumping for joy, bounding off the freeway and into the meadow. Pretty soon, the hungry Wumps were munching away on the tall, tender grass. Now, there was new hope for their world. In time, the murky skies would clear up and the rains would wash away the scum from the rivers and lakes. The tall buildings would eventually come down, crumbling away, and the freeways would crack and be taken over by plants. In time, the green growth would wind its way back into the world, but the Wump World would never be quite the same. And this is a very important story for us to protect our parks and keep what nature we have clean so that our world can stay balanced for things like the Wumps and us. Thanks for listening.